forward on this. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. Thanks for joining us for week 2 of Set Your Summer Training Cycle Up for Success. My name is Elizabeth Karr. I'm a doctor of physical therapy, and tonight we're talking all about strength training for runners. And if you've ever met me, you know that I am a huge proponent of strength training, and I think it's really important for our runners. So whether you've been strength training for years with your running, or you've been running but not strength training and you're new to this, trying to figure out how it works, or just trying to optimize the routine you already have, I hope that you learned something tonight. So, um, in case you are not already strength training, first I want to talk about why you should strength train. So, first of all, you're building resilient structures for running. So, every time you take a step, you're loading your bones, your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments with 2 to 3 times upwards of your body weight. So, you need to be able to handle a lot of load and control a lot of load. So, something we talk about with running is it's a single leg sport, and there's a lot of control rotation wise, right? When you're on one leg to not basically fall over the other direction. So that takes a lot of strength. And running does build some amount of muscle, but it doesn't build that really resilient strength that helps you to, have strong form, not get injured. The second one being bone density. So, strength training is great for everyone to build your bone density. The younger you start, the higher you can peak your bone density so that as you age, and we know bone density decreases as you age, you start from a higher point and you are less likely to have osteoporosis or osteopenia later in life. Third, power and speed. So having strong muscles was what's going to allow you to push off hard from the ground, to have a strong push off, and run quickly. It allows you to recover more quickly from your runs. So all really good things, and of course, injury prevention is the number one. And then, of course, one trip grocery haul. I think everyone should be strength training, whether or not they're a runner, because it's just good for life. It's going to help you move boxes. It's going to help you pick up your kids, get off the ground without having to lean on some furniture, carry all the groceries in at once. Strength training is it's for life skills, and it's good for everyone. Next thing I want to talk about is busting some myths. Number one thing, I think, an old thing, I think we're getting really away from this, is lifting will make you bulky, or taking it a step further, like bulky runners don't run fast. Neither of those are true. Lifting will help you gain muscle mass, but if you're running a lot, you're not going to look like a power lifter. It's just not how it works. And it's different types of lifting, so not a concern. Runners should not lift heavy. Some people think that runners should just do lightweight, high repetition, and that's not the case. There's a lot of research out there really supporting that heavy lifting is good for injury prevention, it's good for power production, all these really great things. So, lifting heavy, and we'll talk about how heavy means a different thing for everyone, but it's a good thing. And then last myth that I think is also going out of style, thankfully, is no knees over toes. I remember hearing that a lot when I was younger. People saying, "Oh, don't let your knees go over your toes." That's not really true. We have to let our knees go over our toes in order to get up out of a chair, to walk backwards, to go down the stairs. So it's really functional, and it's something that we actually might want to train on purpose to make our quads stronger. All right. So the first thing we have to talk about is making a plan for strength training. So if you're new to strength training and you've been just running, strength training is going to be the first thing to go when life gets busy, your training schedule gets busy. Strength training will fall off your calendar unless you have a good plan. So where and when I think are the most important things actually when you're creating the routine of strength training. So where it can be your house, it can be at a gym. Think about what's going to be the most helpful for you when trying to be consistent. Are you going to be more consistent if you're, getting out of your house? There's fewer distractions. There's more equipment. Is that going to help you be consistent, or do we need to take away the barrier of leaving the house and just do stuff that you can do, with a few dumbbells and some bands and stuff like that at your house? Is that going to make you a little bit more compliant with regular strength training? So that's something that you kind of have to be introspective on and think about what's going to be best for you. And then when are you going to do it? That's the other thing that's going to help you be consistent. Do you know that you have to do your workouts in the morning? Do you think there's a day of the week where you could squeeze it in after work, maybe before dinner? And then we'll talk about the logistics of scheduling it with your runs a little bit later in this talk. But putting it on the calendar, like go to the gym, you know, 7:15 a.m. Wednesday, or whatever that might be, is going to help you be consistent. And then what we're going to spend the majority of this presentation talking about is the what. So, what are you going to do when you go to the gym? And having that as a plan is really helpful. I think I keep it in a notes app on my phone, or you can write it on a sticky note or whatever works for you. But when you're training, your time is valuable. We all have busy schedules. And when, especially you're training for a longer race, like a marathon, those long runs start taking up a big chunk of your day. So being efficient when you go to the gym, not just kind of mindlessly wandering around or thinking like, oh, what should I do? Or looking at various Instagram videos, trying to discern what you should do. Having a plan before you go in is going to help you stick with the plan, be efficient, get that workout done. All right, so this is the overview of the what, and we're going to dive into the nitty gritty a little bit. So for runners, I recommend strength training 2 to 3 times per week. 2 is great, 3 is amazing. So figure out what's going to work with your schedule. You're going to focus on key muscle groups, which we're going to review what I suggest for runners to focus on. Spoiler alert, we're going to be focusing on our legs mainly because that's what's taking up a lot of load and propelling us as we run. And when you're deciding how many reps and sets and weight, I always tell my runners, you want to choose a moderately challenging weight, something that you could do about 6 to 10 reps or 2 to 4 sets. So usually that's 6 reps I'm pairing with 4 sets. And if we're going like 8 to 10 reps, we're doing maybe 2 or 3 sets, depending on the exercise. So when you get to the end of your set, you want to be ready for that rest break. And that's how you know that you're choosing a challenging enough weight. And when you're starting out, it might look like body weight. So we're always going to want to start with good form with body weight, and then you can start adding that, whatever a moderately challenging weight means to you. And then we want to have a variety of types of exercises incorporated. So what do I mean by that? Types of exercises. First, stability. So like I said, running is a single leg sport. You are never on 2 legs when you're running. So I like my runners to train as such because when we're on 1 leg, there's a lot of different forces that are being applied to the body that we have to control. So you'll notice a lot of the exercises that I recommend are single leg or a modified single leg type exercise. And then a compound lift, usually if you're into strength training, we think of these as like our primary lifts. So something like a squat or a deadlift is what I'm primarily thinking about for runners. And these are exercises that work multiple muscle groups at a time. And typically this is where you want to go a little bit heavier. And then finally, plyometrics. So these are jumping type exercises. So something like hopping, single leg hopping, like a tuck jump or a lunge jump or something like this. And the reason these are really great is because when we're running, a lot of our muscles, especially in the lower leg, like the calves and the Achilles tendon, act like a spring. So they store energy and they release energy. And that kind of helps us propel forward. So when we train a springy kind of jumpy movement, it helps us to prepare those muscles and tendons to do that on the run and be resilient. Okay, so key muscle groups. You don't have to work every single muscle group that I'm going to talk about every single time. And depending on what your injury history is, what you're training for, you might want to have more focus on certain groups. But everybody needs to train their glutes. So we often joke about half of our job is teaching runners how to use their glutes. Our glutes are a primary muscle for push off and getting that leg behind you when you run. And if the glutes aren't pulling their weight, other smaller muscle groups like the hamstrings, the calves, and the back are going to have to work harder and can end up with an overuse injury. So we really want our primary push off muscle when we're running to be our hip extensors, so like glute max primarily. So that's one that I recommend for everyone. Next up, quads. So quads are the muscles on the front of your thighs, and these are really important for absorbing force through the leg. When you land, that knee is bent and it's absorbing a lot of forces. And these quads are really important also when you're running downhill. So this is something where I'm talking like race specific goals. If you're running something like Boston, where there's a lot of downhill in the beginning of the run, you want to have really strong quads so that they're not fatigued by the time you get halfway through that race. Quads are always important to train, but if you're maybe running something more like a Chicago that's really flat, it might be less of a need to do a specific exercise to focus on that, like downhill eccentric quad loading. And in this, I'm also including hip flexors. So hip flexors are like the highest part of your quads and up near your groin kind of, and they bring your leg forward. So they're really active during running. And especially recommend that people train these if you've had a history of hip flexor strain, that pain in the front of the hip, or if you can't seem to stretch your hips out, they're always tight. Sometimes we say strengthen to lengthen is how we get the muscles stronger and then they're less tight. Next up, hamstrings. So that's the back of your thigh that bends your knee and has a role in assisting with push off. These are important throughout the gait cycle, and they're especially important and work harder the faster you go. Strengthening them can help reduce risk of a hamstring pull and a hamstring injury. We just want to keep that whole back chain of the leg really strong. Next up, your hip stabilizers. So my primary one that I want to talk about is hip abductors. So that's going to be the side of your hips, your glutes, your glute med, specifically medius. Those muscles help to stabilize the pelvis when you're running. So when we're talking about a single leg sport, you're on one leg. Sometimes that pelvis likes to drop down on one side, and it's really your hip abductors that help with that, and a little bit of adductors. So that's outside and inside, respectively. And then calves. I think calves, along with the hip stabilizers, kind of get underloved in a lot of typical strength training programs. And I like to include them in my runner's strength training programs, especially if you've ever had a history of like an Achilles injury or like shin splints, stuff like that. Calf strength is going to be your friend. So load them up heavy. The soleus takes on something close to 5 times body weight is what they found in some studies. So working on calf strength and then that bounciness, those plyometrics is really great there. Core strength, obviously important. That's helping us to stay upright, helps with that rotational control. The good news is you can do core strength specifically, but a lot of the exercises when you're on one leg, you're going to start targeting that core also. And then upper body. You want to give upper body a little bit of love as well. Just because upper body strength is great for daily life, picking things up, etc. You don't need to be able to overhead press, a ton of weight as a runner to be functional with your running. But I really like to focus on back strength. Because strong back helps with that strong arm swing. So a lot of like row type exercises are what I usually prescribe. And then sometimes back exercises or back strengthening is already included when you're doing something like a deadlift. We're really engaging those lats already. So that can be helpful there. All right. So now we're going to kind of get into some nitty-gritty ideas of exercises, just because I gave you some muscle groups, but you might be thinking, what do I need to do to work those muscles? So some exercises that I like for runners, and there's some pictures here, are just your traditional back squat. You could do this with a bar, with dumbbells on your shoulders. But this is really going to target the glutes and the quads and a little bit core. And goblet squat is another great variation. I like doing this with a kettlebell, but you could also do it with a dumbbell held at your chest level. This is a really great one too. Single leg squat is really relevant for running. So when we're doing a single leg squat, we're looking at how that knee is moving over the toes. And this is true for all lunging and squatting type patterns, but we want that knee to track straight over the toes, not wobbling inside or out. So a single leg squat can be really good, especially if you notice like your knees hit when you run. This might be a good exercise for you to train. Um, there's something in the chat. Any recommendation on chest trunk inclination on these? Yeah, so um, let me talk about that in a second. So rear foot elevated squat, or sometimes Bulgarian split squats. If you've done them before, most people are like, "Oh, I hate these." They're really great. They are like a modified single leg position. So they're really good for working on that single leg control. And then I really like them for getting low and working on that quad. So the question was, do you have recommendations on trunk inclination, like how much forward lean you're getting? And yes, so if you want to focus on your quads, so the muscles in the front of your thighs, you're going to want to be more upright. That's going to bias the load through the quads. And then if you want to focus on more glute strength, you're going to want to focus on a little bit of a hip hinge where you're leaning from the waist. It's not the same as rounding the back, but that's where the trunk inclination really makes a difference. And then as with back squatting, there's a little bit of variation person to person. Um, your femur length actually affects how you squat and how much forward lean you need. So everyone's squat looks a little bit different, and I like to respect that when we're looking at squat form. But especially with like rear foot elevated split squat, if you're more upright, you're going to get more quads. That knee is going to go more over the toes. And if you hinge at the hips more, you'll feel it more in your glutes. So it's kind of dependent on your goals as a runner. Next thing, lunges and deadlifts. And again, you should not do all of these exercises every time. I'm just giving you ideas. So we'll kind of go into how to pair this together. Um, a deadlift, so that's where you hinge at the hips. You can also do it with something called a trap bar, which is helpful if you've had any back pain. This is a good compound lift to really load up heavy. And then single leg deadlift, my favorite exercise. I couldn't tell you enough good things about it. It's single leg, so it's really applicable for runners. It strengthens the glutes, it strengthens the hamstrings. You're working on foot control, so you know, that wobbliness. You get a little bit of core work with that rotation control. Love these. One of my favorite exercises. Forward lunge and backwards lunge. Forward lunge is going to focus a little bit more on that quad, and then backwards lunge is going to focus a little bit more on the glutes. So again, which one you do is a little bit of a personal preference, what your goals are. Curtsy lunge, that's when that back leg tucks behind the front leg. This challenges the hip abductors and adductors a little bit more, also getting regular glute and quad strength as well. And then lateral lunge, going to strengthen a little bit more on that outside hip that you're landing on, and then a little bit of the opposite adductor. So those are a little bit more of that inside-outside stability. Just an option for when you're choosing. And then a little bit more hip strength. So these are all focused on hips mainly, hips and quads, little hamstring. Hip thrusters. I really like these for my runners because this focuses on that end range hip extension strength. So the glutes working at the end of their range as they're pushing the leg behind you when you run. So when you think about a squat or a deadlift, the hardest part of the movement, the heaviest load, is when you're in the bottom of that squat and your hip is flexed. So like your knees are coming towards your chest. And that's great. But this is really making you work the hardest part at that end range where that hip is going into extension. And that's something that I find that a lot of runners have to work on. So you can add weight to these. You can start with body weight. You can start double leg. This picture right here is showing single leg. So that's one option. Resisted hip flexion is the next picture with the kettlebell on the foot. You could use a band, but this is going to strengthen that hip flexor. Again, if you've had a hip flexor injury, strengthening the hip flexor is a good thing to do. And then hip abduction plank. This is another one of my favorites. So I talked about that hip drop where we see one hip drop below the level of the other. This guy is really hard. So this is the full plank version. You can put a knee down as a modification, but that's strengthening that gluteus medius that helps keep the hips level as you run. And Casey will probably talk about this in her running gait video, but that is really important for controlling your hip, knee, and ankle alignment while you run. So love this exercise. And then kind of its opposite twin is the Copenhagen plank or the adductor plank, where your top leg is on a bench or a chair and you lift the bottom leg up to meet it. So instead of strengthening the abductors, the abductors outside of the hip, you're strengthening the adductors, the inside. So if you've had like a groin pull or something like this is when I usually program this for my runners. All right, a little bit of core work here. Any variation of a plank is great for a runner because we're working on stability, that deep core, and trunk strength. So you can do a regular plank hold. You can start adding in some leg lifts, some shoulder taps, different things like that. Next, we have a bird dog, which is when you're on all fours and you reach opposite arm and leg in opposite directions. This is not a great view of it, but that's what that is. Really great because you're working that cross body strength. So when we're running, it's opposite arm and leg. This is opposite arm and leg. Dead bug, again, it's kind of like we take that bird dog and flip it on its back, working on controlling the core and the pelvis as we move arm and leg away from the center. And then last one here is farmer carry. So this picture shows it with an overhead carry, which is great. You're incorporating some upper body. It's going to engage your core more. But you can do it with weights down by your side. You can do it with a weight on one side. There's a million different ways to do it. And upper body examples, bent over row, that's going to get the middle back. A middle row, so like the rowing machine at the gym is great for this, or a heavy band, pulling those shoulders back. We all kind of sit like this on our phones and our computers. I call it being a desk gremlin. So strengthening up that back so that you can have good posture while you run and a solid arm swing. And then a lat pull down is another good one for the back. And then finally, calf strength. I love calf strength. So heel raises are great. I think that more people should do them. And you can do them with a straight knee, which targets a muscle, the calf muscle that's on top. It's called the gastrocnemius. And you can do them with a bent knee, which is the deeper muscle called the soleus, which is actually more active during running. So I recommend doing both of those. You can see here that I'm holding a weight in the same leg that's going up and down. I'm doing a single leg. If single leg's too hard, you could do double leg. All of these are kind of like building blocks, right? So start with what you can do. And once it gets easy, make it harder. That's kind of the gist of strength training. Farmer carry on toes. So same thing I talked about in the last 2 slides ago, where you're walking, holding weight. If you do it on your toes, you start loading the calves more. And then finally, plyometrics, jumping exercises are going to load the calves more. So that was a whirlwind. And I just gave all those examples because I think if I was new to strength training or when I was new to strength training, it was really helpful to see examples of exercises. But now we need to talk about how you decide what to work on. So I usually say, pick those key muscle groups. So I like personally, my strength routine works on my glutes, my hip extension, my quads, hip abductors, and calves. Get a little bit of core in there. So pick about 5 to 6 muscle groups to focus on, and then pick exercises that support that. So I made you a little cheat sheet here. Okay, so if you want to screenshot this, you are welcome to. But this gives you examples of exercises and what they're focusing on. So, like I said, everyone's strength training program is going to look a little bit different based on what they're working on. But everyone needs to strengthen their glutes and their quads and their hamstrings, in my opinion, and hip stability. So pick something that covers all those. Pick 5 to 6 exercises, I would say, to start. It should take you around 25 to 35 minutes. If it takes you longer than that, put your phone away. That's what I've learned. Um, but you can make this happen 2 to 3 times a week, 25 to 35 minutes. It doesn't need to be complicated. And then another thing I want to talk about, I know I just showed you a bajillion exercises, but you can always do another exercise. That's what I always tell people, and it's really easy to get lost in that of, well, I saw on Instagram that, my Seidel does this exercise, or I saw this running influencer doing this crazy exercise, and it might be a good exercise. It might be a great one, but we could always add another one in, and then you're going to be in the gym for 2 hours, and that's just not sustainable. So finding a routine that works for you, that's diverse, that challenges you, and that you can fit into your schedule is important. So, speaking of scheduling, so in a perfect world, you keep the hard days hard. So, your strength training should be done on like your speed work day or your long run, and then you're ideally getting 3 days in. Life happens. You might have a job, you might be in school, you might have kids or volunteering commitments. And sometimes it doesn't work like that, where you have the luxury of doing 2 workouts in one day. A lot of us don't have that luxury. So the reality is, make it work for your schedule. So this is kind of an example of what I do. I have the luxury of not working on Mondays. So I do my run and my strength on Mondays. And then Tuesdays is usually an easier run. Wednesdays is usually a faster run. And then Thursdays, I get another strength session in. And then Saturdays is when I do my long run. So that's just what works for my schedule. And you have to figure out what works for your schedule. Sometimes I get an extra strength day in, sometimes I don't. If you can help it, try to keep from doing a heavy lift the night before speed work or a long run or a key workout for your training plan, because you want to have fresh legs. So when you're training for a race, your running is your primary goal. So running comes first. So if you're doing 2 in one day, I usually recommend getting your run in first if that works for your schedule. And then if you're like going back to back, run, refuel, and then do your strength training. I don't usually recommend strength training right before you run when you're in a training cycle. If you're spreading them out throughout the day, it doesn't matter as much as long as you make sure you're getting that fuel in between. And then I do always recommend at least 1 full day of rest. No cross training, not going to a yoga class, just rest, no exercise. That rest day is really important to let all that hard work that you're doing for your training, with your running, with your strength training, to give your body time to synthesize the work you put in, build new muscles, and get you ready for the next week. And then finally, how do you fit it in with your training cycle? So as you are building your running volume, you can build your training volume too, your strength training volume. So that means increasing your weight as things get harder. You might have a day where your legs feel really tired. You had a really hard workout that week. And it's okay if you have to drop your weight a little bit that week, but you want to be keeping it so that you're ready for that break at the end of the set. So you can increase your strength training load throughout as you hit that peak. And then when you taper your running, you taper your strength training. You don't have to stop, but you can decrease your weight. Maybe you go down to body weight. Maybe if you're doing 3 sets of 10, you're doing 2 sets of 10 because you want to have those fresh legs for race day. So that's how you would fit it in with your peaking with your running. All right. So my hope for you is that you realize that strength training doesn't need to be complicated or intimidating. You don't need a ton of equipment. You could do it from home. Pick exercises that fit your lifestyle, but still challenge yourself. The most important thing is to make a plan that fits your needs and stick to it. So figure out what days it's going to work for you to do your strength and sync it up with your long runs and your easy runs. Figure out what time of day where you're going to do it. And then incrementally increase your challenge. You're going to get stronger. Um, and then you got to be like, oh man, I got to the end of that set. That was kind of easy. Okay, add 5 pounds. See how that feels. Odds are you're going to be able to keep adding 5 pounds. And that's a really good feeling. So these are my little takeaways that I tell people. Some is better than none. So if you get 15 minutes or 10 or even 5 minutes of strength training in, it's better than zero. So if you get one exercise in, it's better than doing absolutely nothing. Keep it simple. Like I said, we don't need a lot of crazy equipment. If it takes you longer to set up than it does to do the exercise, it might be too complicated. Just make it easy. And we only get better at things that we practice. This goes for running, this goes for strength training, this goes for life. So if you go to the gym for the first time and it's really hard and you're really sore the next day, don't give up. Don't just throw in the towel. Go back, try again. The more you go, the more you're consistent, the easier it gets, the less intimidating it gets, and the stronger and the faster you get. So um, I hope that this helps you feel confident in going to the gym and, trying out some new equipment, starting implementing strength training into your weekly plan. And yeah, if you have any questions, please reach out. And it was great getting to chat with you. And then I'm going to stop.